Professor Ilvek Soran had taught comparative xenobehavior for 11 cycles, and in that time she had catalogued the mating displays of the Pharaoh collective, the grief rituals of the Banthean, and the truly alarming courtship spiral of the Vurn, which involved biting. None of it had prepared her for the semester a human enrolled in her elective. The academy sat in orbit above a neutral world called Seset Station, a slow gray wheel of classrooms and docking rings where 41 species sent their brightest to learn how not to accidentally start a war with each other. Ilvex's species, the Thessaline, were cold-blooded, silver-scaled, and built for patience. They ran their classrooms the way they ran everything else, calmly, methodically, with excellent documentation. Her lecture hall had 300 years of collected behavioral data on file. She had, by her own estimation, seen everything worth seeing. Then a human named Dane Alcott walked into her 10 a.m. section, sat in the front row because the back rows were built for creatures with tails, and raised his hand during the very first lecture to ask if the reason everyone kept flinching away from him was that he smelled bad. He did not smell bad. That was, in fact, the problem, though Ilvex did not know it yet. She had agreed to let him enroll as a favor to the Academy's Interspecies Outreach Office, which was always looking for what they called living case studies. Actual members of a species sitting in the room while she lectured about them, available to be pointed at and occasionally prodded with a stylus for demonstration purposes. Humans were new to galactic society, recently contacted, wildly popular as a subject of study, and almost impossible to get an actual specimen of, because the handful who had made it out to the frontier were mostly busy being terrifyingly competent at jobs nobody else wanted, like debris field welding and asteroid demolition. Dane was 26 years old, worked as a structural technician on the station's outer ring, and had signed up for her class, he explained, because his shift supervisor said understanding how the rest of you people think would help him stop accidentally causing minor panics in the corridors. You cause panics, Ilvex repeated on that first day, testing the word. All the time, he said cheerfully. Yesterday I hugged a guy from maintenance because he fixed my locker jam and he screamed. Like actually screamed. I thought he was hurt. Turns out he thought I was going to eat him. The lecture hall, 60 students, a dozen species, none of whom had ever been within 3 meters of an unsupervised human, went very quiet. That is, Ilvex said slowly, an excellent segue into today's material. She pulled up her prepared slides. Humans, first contact reports agreed, were bewildering. They were a species that fell technologically between industrial and post-industrial, that had reached the stars mostly by being stubborn about it, and that came bundled with a set of biological quirks nobody had adequately explained in the 3 years since first contact. She had built an entire semester around trying. The first quirk was sleep. Human sleep cycles are, from a predator species perspective, an act of profound trust or profound insanity, depending on who you ask, Ilvex told the class, while Dane sat in the front row eating what she would later learn was called a granola bar and looking unbothered by being lectured about. A sleeping human is nearly unreachable. Threat response, environmental awareness, motor function, all of it drops to functionally zero. There are recorded cases of humans sleeping through structural fires, artillery exchanges, and in one well-documented incident, an entire building collapsing 1 floor below them. A Cathari student near the back, small, quilled, deeply anxious by temperament as her species tended to be, raised a tentacle. What wakes them then, if not danger? Excellent question. The honest answer, according to human testimony, is smell of food, a song they don't like, or nothing at all, they just wake up. Ilvex glanced at Dane. Mr. Alcott, confirm or deny? Confirm, he said. I slept through a fire alarm test in my dorm last month. My roommate had to physically shake me. Meanwhile, if someone so much as opens a bag of chips 2 rooms over, I'm up instantly. It's not a good system. I've made peace with it. For a Cathari, Ilvex said, this would represent roughly 6 months of continuous, unthinkable vulnerability. For a human, Dane said, it's Tuesday. There is, apparently, Ilvex added, checking the report open on her tablet, a documented case of a human construction worker sleeping through a demolition roughly 200 meters from his position, waking only when the dust settled on his face, at which point he reportedly checked the time, said something the translator rendered only as an expletive, and went back to sleep for another 11 minutes. "Yeah, that tracks," Dane said. "We've got priorities. Dust on the face, mildly annoying. Demolition itself, apparently background noise." The class laughed. A mixed noise, clicks and hums, and the dry rasp that passed for laughter among the Thessalon. And Ilvex found herself, against all professional instinct, laughing too. She logged it as an anomaly and moved on to the second slide, on human tolerance thresholds, and did not examine the anomaly further, because examining it would have required admitting that a human had made her laugh in front of 60 students, and Thessaline professors did not have that kind of week. There was, in that first week, a second detail worth noting, though Ilvex did not think much of it at the time. A Kethari student named Priyash, small, quilled, meticulous in her notes, prone to worrying about things no one else had thought to worry about, had taken to sitting one seat away from Dane, close enough to ask him questions between lectures, far enough that she could pretend to herself and to everyone else that this was purely academic curiosity about an unusual specimen. Ilvex noted it the way she noted most things in her classroom, filed it away without particular weight, and moved on to the next slide. She would have cause to remember it later, in more detail than she expected. It became, over the following month, a pattern. Dane was not a good student in the conventional sense. He was late twice, fell asleep once during a 3-hour lecture on Banthine grief cycles, and only woke because the Kethari next to him panicked and elbowed him, mistaking his stillness for death. But he was an extraordinary specimen, in the specific sense that he had absolutely no idea how strange he was, which made him the single best case study the Academy had ever produced. The caffeine lecture in particular became legendary. Ilvex had prepared it carefully. Human stimulant tolerance was, by the numbers, absurd. A dose of the substance called caffeine that would put most warm-blooded predator species into cardiac distress was, for humans, a beverage they drank recreationally, sometimes twice before what they called actually starting the day. She had ordered a sample from the station's one human-run kiosk specifically to demonstrate, carefully measured, carefully diluted, offered first to a volunteer Vern student who took one sip and had to be walked to the medical bay by 2 classmates, vibrating. That was a quarter-strength dose, Ilvex said, over the Vern's distant, echoing groan from the hallway. "Mr. Alcott, would you demonstrate the equivalent full-strength human dose?" Dane, without hesitation, drank the entire cup. "That's decent," he said. "Little weak, honestly. This place ever get real espresso, or is it all filtered through the recycler?" 60 students stared at him in silence, broken only by the Vern, somewhere down the hall, asking if it was going to die. "He is not," Ilvex said, mostly to herself, checking her tablet, even slightly agitated. "His pulse is elevated by 4%. "I run on this stuff," Dane said. "You want to see agitated? Take it away from me for 3 days. That's when the real chaos starts." The following week's lecture was, if anything, more disruptive to the room's collective composure, because it concerned physical contact. Humans, Ilvex explained, standing well back from her own demonstration table, engage in a behavior called hugging, which involves full-body contact, typically initiated with no warning, and which they appear to categorize as comforting rather than threatening. This is, from the perspective of most prey instinct species, a deeply counterintuitive signal. Full-body contact from an apex predator species should read as a restraint hold. It does not. Human test subjects across multiple first contact reports describe it as, quote, "the nicest thing that can happen to you on a bad day. How do we know when it's coming?" asked Priyash, the small quilled Kethari who had, by that point, spent 3 consecutive lectures sitting exactly 1 seat away from Dane and asking him a disproportionate number of questions for someone supposedly there to study his species, and not him specifically. "You mostly don't," Dane said before Ilvex could answer. "That's kind of the whole thing. If we waited for permission every time, we'd never do it. Also, for the record, I don't just hug anybody. There's a whole system. Friends get the quick one, arm around the shoulder. Somebody who's actually having a rough day gets the long one. Family gets whatever they need, no timer on it. There is a timer. This from a Vern near the front, still faintly reproachful about the caffeine demonstration. Not literally, but yeah. You can feel when someone's ready to let go before they say anything. It's not complicated once you've done it a few times. Demonstrate, Ilvex said, mostly out of professional curiosity, though she would admit later, only to herself, that a smaller and much less professional part of her wanted to see it too. Dane looked around the room, correctly read that most of the class was too nervous to volunteer, and settled on the safest possible option. Priyesh, who went rigid with anticipation the moment he stood up, and then visibly did not know what to do with her own quills when his arm came around her shoulders in the quick one. Brief, warm, entirely without ceremony, gone again within 4 seconds. "See?" Dane said, sitting back down while Priyesh remained very still, quills half raised, processing. "Nobody died, she's fine, aren't you fine?" "I am," Priyesh said in a voice slightly higher than her usual register. "Extremely fine." The room laughed, and Ilvex, watching the exchange with the same clinical attention she brought to every lecture, made a note in the margin of her tablet that had nothing to do with human physiology and everything to do with the particular way a Thessaline student 2 rows behind Priyesh, a quiet, serious young man named Sethrin, who rarely spoke in class and had clearly been building up the nerve to speak to Priyesh for at least as long as Priyesh had been building up the nerve to speak to Dane, had gone very still watching the whole thing, in the specific way of someone recalculating whether they too might eventually be brave enough to ask a question out loud in front of 60 people. Ilvex filed that observation away as well. She was by profession someone who noticed patterns before anyone else in the room did. It would take her the better part of the semester to admit that she was noticing this particular pattern, because it mirrored with uncomfortable precision her own. It was around week 5 that Ilvex began to notice the second, quieter pattern, the one that had nothing to do with lecture material, that she had started arriving to class 10 minutes early, which she had never done in 11 years of teaching, because the 10 minutes before the lecture hall filled was the 10 minutes Dane usually spent leaning against her desk, asking her questions that weren't on any syllabus. What did Thessaline eat? Was it true they needed heat lamps? And if so, did that mean she was cold right now? And should he do something about that? Did she ever get to go home, wherever home was? Or was teaching a lifetime posting? Small questions, unimportant questions, the kind a species built for patience did not usually get asked because most people assumed the answers didn't matter. Ilvex found that she liked answering them. She found this deeply inconvenient. One evening, well past the hour her office hours were meant to end, Dane asked if she'd ever actually tried human food, given how much of the semester she'd spent lecturing about the species that made it. Ilvex admitted she had not, on the grounds that most human cuisine, as far as she understood it, involved temperatures and spice compounds calibrated for a metabolism nothing like her own. "There's stuff that won't put you in the medical bay," he said. "Come on. The kiosk on Ring 6 does a decent broth and noodle thing, mild. Nothing weird in it. I'll even test it first if it makes you feel better." "That is not necessary." "I'm doing it anyway. Professor Privilege. You've been feeding me caffeine and Vern courtship footage for 2 months. I get to return the favor once." They ended up at the kiosk long after the dinner rush, Dane at ease on a stool built for a species half again his size. Ilvex perched more carefully, tail curled around the base of hers, watching him eat with the same clinical attention she brought to a lecture slide and finding, uncomfortably, that it did not feel clinical at all. He asked her, between bites, what Thessaline did for pleasure when they weren't teaching, whether they read, whether they had music, whether the deep, quiet patience her species was known for ever got restless the way his did. She found herself answering more honestly than she generally answered anyone, telling him about the long migratory songs her Hatch clan used to sing before the cold season, about how she'd left her home world at 19 cycles old and had not been back since, about how teaching had become, without her quite noticing it happen, the only home she'd kept. "That's not sad," he said, when she pointed out, almost apologetically, that the story had gotten heavier than she'd intended. That's just a person who built a new home out of a job she's good at. Nothing wrong with that. Though I'd bet the songs were nice. You should sing me one sometime. Off the record, you are exceptionally forward for a student. Former student soon, he said, unbothered. I did the math. 6 more weeks. She had not, in fact, done that math herself, and was faintly alarmed to discover how much of her attention had apparently been quietly tracking the semester's remaining length without her permission. You're counting, she said. Course I am. He said it simply, the way he said most things, no performance in it at all. Figured somebody should. It was, Ilvex thought later. Walking back to her quarters through the station's long night cycle dimming, an entirely unremarkable evening by any objective measure. Noodles, conversation, nothing declared outright. And yet she found she had catalogued every minute of it with a thoroughness she usually reserved for genuinely significant research data. She added no formal entry to her file that night. She simply lay awake longer than usual, running the evening back through her memory the way her own students, she suspected, replayed lectures they hadn't wanted to end. You're doing the thing again, said her colleague, Professor Rendabruska, a broad, weathered instructor of applied diplomacy who had known Ilvex for 9 cycles and considered it her personal duty to notice things. They were in the staff commissary, and Ilvex had been staring at the same cup of nutrient broth for 4 minutes without drinking it. What thing? The thing where you go quiet and reptilian and pretend you're thinking about lesson plans, when actually you're thinking about your human. He is not my human. He is a case study. Ilvex. You gave him extra office hours. You do not have office hours. You invented them specifically for him. He asked good questions. He asked you if your scales get cold. That's not a question about xenobehavioral theory. That's a question a person asks somebody they like. Ilvex did not have a response to this that did not involve admitting Ren was correct, so she drank her broth instead, which her colleague took, accurately, as a confession. The thing about humans, Ilvex would eventually write in her private research notes, in a section she did not initially intend to share with the department, was that all the strange biology, the tolerance, the sleep, the unnerving physical calm around danger, the pheromonal effect that made every prey instinct species on the station a little dizzy when a human stood close and relaxed. None of it was actually the interesting part. The interesting part was that humans applied all of that considerable, terrifying capability toward the single, narrow, absurd goal of making the people around them comfortable. A human who could out-endure poison, outsleep a bombing raid, and reportedly bench-press their own body weight without particular effort, spent most of their actual daily energy making sure the Cathari next to them in the cafeteria didn't feel embarrassed about needing 3 napkins, or that the Vern student recovering from a caffeine incident had someone to walk her back to her dorm. It made the species as a subject almost impossible to categorize. Predator biology, caretaker behavior, a being built like a small disaster who spent all its effort trying not to be one. The lecture on human physical capacity, delivered the same week, only reinforced the point. Ilvex had pulled the figures from 3 separate first contact medical surveys. Humans, by every measurement available, used only a fraction of their full muscular output during ordinary activity, some estimates suggesting as little as a third, the rest held in reserve by a nervous system apparently terrified of what would happen if a human ever exerted itself completely. It was, evolutionarily, a safety mechanism. Full output humans, the reports agreed, tended to tear their own muscles from the bone or shatter the very joints doing the lifting. There were documented cases of parents lifting vehicles off trapped children and walking away with fractures they hadn't noticed until afterward. So the reason you all seem unnervingly strong for your size, Ilvex said, is that you are, in fact, unnervingly strong for your size and are actively suppressing most of it at any given moment, purely so you don't injure yourselves. Basically, Dane agreed. It's less hidden power and more safety brake nobody remembers installing. Same thing with pain, honestly. We've got a stupidly high tolerance for it. Doesn't mean it doesn't hurt, just means we can keep working through it a lot longer than we probably should, which every doctor I've ever met says is one of our worst traits, not our best one. A species that is simultaneously stronger than it behaves and more resilient to pain than is medically advisable, Ilvex said. mostly to the room, though she was aware, distantly, that she was also saying it to herself, cataloging him the way she cataloged everything, and which spends the resulting surplus capacity almost entirely on behalf of others. It remains, gentle beings, the single most inefficient design I have encountered in 11 cycles of study. Inefficient how? Dane asked, genuinely curious, the way he always was when she said something he didn't immediately understand. You could conserve that capacity for yourselves. Instead, you spend it lifting vehicles off strangers' children and drinking dangerous stimulants to stay awake, helping people who are not obligated to you in any formal sense. Ilvex paused, aware the room had gone quiet in the particular way it did whenever she said something more personal than the syllabus required. It is not an efficient use of a considerable resource. I confess I no longer find that a criticism. It was around this same stretch of the semester that Sethrin, the quiet Thessaline student 2 rows behind Priush, finally worked up the nerve to say something to her that was not a request to borrow notes. Ilvex only knew this because Priush, flushed a pale lavender along her quills, spent the following lecture unable to concentrate on anything at all, and confided the whole story to Dane in a rushed, breathless whisper before class started, apparently having decided that the human in the front row was now, by unofficial classroom consensus, the resident expert on matters of the heart. He asked if I wanted to study together, Priush whispered. Just the 2 of us, does that mean something, or is that a normal thing your species does, or? It means something, Dane said, without hesitation, the same easy confidence he brought to identifying a caffeine dose or a jammed panel. Trust me, nobody offers to study together unless they've been rehearsing the sentence in the mirror first. Ilvex, arriving early as she now always did, caught the tail end of this exchange and found herself, not for the first time that semester, quietly rooting for an outcome that had nothing to do with her curriculum. It was, she reflected, an inconvenient new habit, caring what happened to people beyond the scope of their coursework. She suspected she would not be breaking it anytime soon. She should have known, professionally, that this was the moment she stopped being an impartial observer. The incident that made it undeniable, to the whole academy, not just to Ren, happened during the semester's mandatory field exercise, a station-wide emergency drill meant to test how different species handled a simulated hull breach. It was meant to be routine. It was not, because the simulation software glitched on Ring 9 and triggered an actual pressure seal instead of a fake one, trapping 11 students, 3 professors, and 1 visiting trade delegate in a service corridor with genuinely falling oxygen levels, while the automated systems tried to figure out what they'd done wrong. Ilvex was one of the professors trapped. She did not panic. Thessaline rarely did, their nervous systems built for slow, deliberate crisis management. But she was aware, distantly, that the corridor's manual override was sealed behind a jammed panel that needed a great deal of force to open, force that none of the students present, mostly small quilled things and delicate diplomatic aids, were built to provide. Among them, huddled together near the far wall where the air was thinnest, were Priush and Sethrin, who had been walking to the drill site together when the seal came down, and who spent the longest, worst minutes of the incident with Sethrin's coat wrapped around Priush's shoulders and his voice steady despite everything, telling her that Thessaline did not startle easily, and neither, apparently, did he intend to. Dane had been 2 corridors over off duty, technically not required to be anywhere near the drill. He got there anyway because the alert had gone out on every channel, and he'd apparently decided that trapped classmates fell under his job description whether or not anyone had asked him to think so. What Ilvex remembered afterward, clearly, in a way she suspected she would remember for the rest of her considerably long Thessaline life, was the sound of the panel giving way. Not slowly, not with tools, but all at once, under his hands, in a single motion that left 4 of her students staring at him with the particular silent awe of creatures who had just watched a textbook chapter happen in front of them. And then his voice, immediately after, entirely calm, asking if everyone was okay. Is anyone hurt? Hey, look at me, breathe. You're fine. Before he'd even finished catching his own breath. Extreme physical output, followed instantly by extreme gentleness, with no visible gap between the two. That was the part the reports would never quite capture. That was the part Ilvex kept turning over afterward, alone in her quarters, running her claws absently along the edge of her desk in a gesture she recognized, uncomfortably, as agitation. "You could have been hurt," she told him later, once the corridor was cleared, and the students debriefed and sent off with the kind of story they'd tell for the rest of their academic careers. "That panel was not rated for manual force. Neither am I, technically," Dane said. He had a shallow cut along one forearm already scabbing that he seemed entirely unconcerned about. "Worked out fine, though. You are unbelievably reckless. I prefer efficient." He was smiling, but there was something steadier underneath it, something that made Ilvex's normally very orderly thoughts scatter in 4 directions at once. "You were in there. That's the part I was thinking about, if I'm being honest. Not the panel." Ilvex, who had given 11 years of lectures on the precise biological mechanisms behind human attachment behavior, discovered in that moment that she had absolutely no professional framework for what to do when it was pointed directly at her. "That is," she said after a pause long enough that Dane's smile started to falter, worried he'd overstepped, "a highly irregular thing to say to your professor." "Yeah," he agreed. "I've been irregular about this for a while now. Figured the corridor almost losing all its air was as good a moment as any to stop pretending otherwise. I teach a class about your species specifically because you are difficult to predict." And I did not predict this," Ilvex said, "and I find that I am not currently upset about it." Which was, for a Thessaline, roughly the equivalent of a declaration written in fire across the sky. And Dane, 3 years into learning a culture not his own, still getting half the idioms wrong, still occasionally hugging people who screamed, understood it perfectly. Word of the corridor incident moved through the academy the way all good stories did, gaining detail with each retelling, until by the following week the version circulating held that Dane had torn the panel off with his bare hands while simultaneously calming a room of panicking students with his voice alone, which was not quite true, but also not quite false. Professor Dobruska found this endlessly funny, mostly because of how it complicated Ilvex's carefully maintained academic reputation. "You're going to have to address it in class," Wren told her over broth 3 days later. "Half your students think your case study fought off an oxygen leak with his bare hands. The other half want to know if you're courting him. Both rumors are, notably, accurate. I have not confirmed the second rumor to anyone. You don't have to. You've been early to your own lectures for 2 months. Thessaline professors are not early to things. It's practically a species trait being unhurried. You're breaking biology." Ilvex did not dignify this with a response which Wren correctly took as agreement. The class, when Ilvex returned to it, had in fact grown considerably more attentive, in the specific way that a room full of students becomes attentive when they suspect their professor's personal life has become part of the curriculum without anyone officially announcing it. She pressed forward anyway because there was still material to cover, and because, she told herself, adjusting her notes with more precision than strictly necessary, a good professor did not let personal matters interrupt the semester's structure. The lecture that day was on bonding behavior, how humans, once attached to someone, tended to stay that way with a persistence that other species found either deeply touching or faintly alarming, depending on temperament. Ilvex had prepared the material weeks earlier before the corridor, before any of it, and found herself now delivering it with an entirely new and uncomfortable awareness of how closely it described her own current situation. "Human pair bonds," she said, to a room that was watching her with far too much interest, "once formed are documented to be extremely durable. Historical accounts describe humans traveling extraordinary distances, enduring extraordinary hardship, for the sake of a bonded partner. The behavior persists even in circumstances where it offers no clear survival advantage, which suggests it is not purely instinctual, but deeply, stubbornly chosen." "Professor," said the Cathari student from the back, the same one who'd asked about sleep weeks ago and had clearly been keeping a private tally of classroom developments ever since. "Is that a general statement or a specific one?" "It is," Ilvex said. "Both. And I would ask that we return to the material." They did not entirely return to the material, because Dane, sitting in the front row where he always sat, said quietly enough that it wasn't quite meant for the whole class, but not quietly enough that the front 3 rows didn't hear it anyway. For what it's worth, Professor, the stubborn part's accurate too. Figured you should have that on record, academically. The room's collective reaction, the Cathari's tentacle shooting straight up in interest, the low amused rasp from 2 Thessalene students in the second row, Wren's voice somehow audible through the wall of the adjoining office where she was very obviously listening, told Ilvex that whatever professional distance she'd hoped to maintain had been some weeks ago now, thoroughly and permanently lost. Class dismissed early, she said, which was against every policy the Academy had, and not one student complained. What happened after that was, by Galactic academic standards, a minor scandal, and by any reasonable standard, exactly what everyone had been expecting for 2 months. Ilvex requested, and was granted, a transfer of her formal advisory relationship with Dane to a colleague, on the grounds that continuing to grade his coursework while also, her words, in the request form, chosen with enormous care, developing a personal regard for the student, represented an obvious conflict of interest. The outreach office, delighted at the unexpected publicity a human Thessalon pairing generated for their recruitment efforts, asked if they could feature the story in the next intake brochure. Ilvex said no. Dane said he didn't see the harm. They compromised on a version with no names attached, which fooled absolutely nobody on the station, all of whom had watched the whole thing unfold in real time across 2 months of lectures. The final class of the semester, the one the outreach office always insisted on for prospective students touring the academy, was traditionally an open lecture, no exam material, just a summary, delivered to whichever curious visitors wandered in. Ilvex stood at the front of a fuller-than-usual hall, Dane in his usual front row seat despite no longer technically being enrolled, and gave what she privately considered the best lecture of her career. Humans, she said, are, from a xenobiological standpoint, an extraordinary contradiction. They possess physical capability disproportionate to their apparent fragility. They sleep with a vulnerability that should be evolutionarily catastrophic and somehow is not. They tolerate substances that would fell a Verne and drink them for pleasure. They are, according to every early threat assessment filed after first contact, among the most quietly dangerous species so far encountered by the wider galactic community. She paused. And every single one of those dangerous capacities in practice seems to exist for the sole purpose of making the beings around them feel safe. It is the strangest design flaw I have ever documented. I am reasonably sure it is not a flaw. Professor, said a new student near the door, one of the touring visitors, a small nervous thing from a species Ilvex didn't recognize. Are you saying humans are dangerous, or that they're not? I am saying, Ilvex said, glancing once briefly at the front row, that the 2 things have turned out in my professional and personal experience not to be in conflict. Class dismissed, permanently this time. It's the last lecture of the term. The students filed out slowly, in no hurry, the way students never were on the last day, some of them lingering to say goodbye to a professor most had genuinely liked despite, or by the end because of, the semester's unusual detour into her personal life. The Cathari student stopped by the desk on her way out. Professor Soren, she said, for what it's worth, I think this was the best elective the Academy's ever run, not because of the material, because of watching you figure it out in real time. That was not the intended lesson plan. No, Priyash agreed, but it was the one that stuck. She hesitated at the door, quills lifting slightly, the way they did whenever she was working up to something. Sethran asked me to move to the frontier posting with him next cycle, structural survey work, out past the Sisset relay. I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence, which he says wasn't very Cathari of me, and which I told him wasn't very Thessalian of him to have asked so plainly in the first place. I think we've both been improved by this class rather more than the syllabus intended. That, Ilvex said, appears to be a running theme this semester. Priyash smiled, quills settling flat and content, and left the 2 of them to the empty hall, in the specific unhurried way of someone whose own story had already found its proper ending, and was no longer in any rush. When the hall had emptied, Dane came up to the desk the way he had on the very first day, leaning against the edge of it, entirely too comfortable for someone technically no longer enrolled in anything Ilvex taught. "So," he said, "semester's over. I'm no longer your student. No conflict of interest, no rules to worry about." "That is correct. Which means I can finally ask you properly, instead of doing it sideways in front of 60 witnesses because I was too nervous to do it any other way. You may ask. Come have dinner with me. Somewhere off station if you want. I hear Césade's got a decent view from the observation ring, and I looked it up. They can keep the room warm enough for you specifically. I already checked. Figured a professor who spent a whole semester studying my species deserves at least one evening where she's not the one doing the studying." Ilvex considered this with the same careful deliberation she brought to everything, turning it over, the way she turned over a difficult research question, though she suspected, even as she did it, that she had already decided weeks ago, somewhere around the moment a jammed panel had come away in his hands and his voice hadn't changed at all in the process. "I accept," she said, "on the condition that you allow me to continue asking questions. Off the record." "Professor," Dane said, smiling in a way that made the careful, patient, 11-cycle-old part of her brain go entirely and pleasantly quiet. "You can ask me anything you want. That's kind of always been the deal." Outside the lecture hall, the station wheeled slowly on through the dark 41 species going about their ordinary lives, none of them aware that somewhere on Ring 6, a very old and very careful theory about how humans worked had just been quietly, thoroughly and permanently confirmed. Not in a lab and not on a slide, but in the plain fact of a professor who had spent a whole semester trying to understand a species from a safe, scholarly distance, and had ended it standing considerably closer than she'd ever planned to. The last entry Ilvex made in her research file that night was shorter than any of the others, and unlike the rest, she did not file it with the department. Subject remains, by every available metric, the most anomalous specimen this researcher has encountered in 11 cycles of study. Recommend continued observation. Indefinitely. Personally. She closed the file, dimmed the lights, and for the first time in 11 years of very orderly Thessaline evenings, found that she was looking forward to tomorrow's lack of a lecture to give. The dinner, when it came, was exactly as warm as Dane had promised. He had, true to his word, checked ahead. The observation ring restaurant had adjusted its heating along one whole section of the room, quietly, without being asked twice, the kind of small, effortful gesture Ilvex had spent a whole semester lecturing about, and had somehow still not been fully prepared to have aimed at her personally. They sat where the station's curve gave a clean view of the stars wheeling slowly past, and for a long while neither of them said very much at all, which, for a Thessaline, was its own kind of comfortable, and which Dane, 3 years into learning her culture, understood well enough not to fill with unnecessary noise. "You're quiet," he said eventually, not as a complaint. "I am thinking," Ilvex said, "that I have spent 11 cycles studying other species from a very safe, very careful distance, and that I find myself this evening no longer particularly interested in safe or careful. That's the best thing anyone said to me all year, and I once had a Vern tell me my aura was acceptably threatening. I am not entirely certain what that means. Neither am I. But your version's better." Outside the wide viewing pane, Césate Station turned on through the dark 41 species going about their ordinary lives. A Kethari and a Thessaline student somewhere on Ring 9 packing crates for a frontier posting. Neither of them would have had the courage to request 6 months earlier. A Vern somewhere recovering, finally, from a caffeine incident that had become station legend. 60 former students carrying home a slightly better understanding of a species most of them had arrived only faintly afraid of, and none of it for once was Ilvex's to catalog. She let it go on without her, for one evening, and simply sat across from the single most anomalous specimen of her considerable career, and found that she did not want to be anywhere else in the galaxy. "So," Dane said, refilling her glass without being asked, the way he did most things worth noticing, "same time next week?" "I would," Ilvex said, "be amenable to that becoming a pattern." "Good," he said. "I was hoping you'd say that. I've gotten pretty attached to being your favorite anomaly. You were never merely an anomaly. No, No, she said. You were, from the very first lecture, the variable I did not know how to account for. I have decided I no longer wish to. Dane smiled at that in the unhurried, entirely certain way of a species built. Whatever the textbook said about danger and tolerance and hidden strength, mostly for exactly this, for staying, for choosing, for making the quiet ones feel, for once, entirely unafraid of being close. And outside the window the station turned and did not stop, and neither, it seemed, did they.